Hey, this is Dr. Centeno, and welcome to the COVID Fact Fiction Show, Episode 5. So, this is your weekly deep dive into what's going on with COVID-19, trying to separate the medical facts from the media fiction. So, let's dive in. So, I always start with masks. There's always something going on with masks. So, let's dive in there. Again, I wear my masks where I'm supposed to. This is my N95 mask that I wear in the clinic. I wear them out and about, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not opposed to masks at all. I am opposed, though, to bad research. So these are some of the stories that are out there this week, all about this one study that was performed, pretty cool, using a cell phone by some physicists and some laser light to try to measure the efficiency of various masks. And this is the study. Basically, what they did is they put masks on people. They had them kind of talk into a box. And then they used the cell phone and the laser light to measure these small droplets that everyone's concerned about. If we take apart this study, the good news is that, this is a low cost way to measure what's happening with those water droplets and these masks. The bad news is that they never measured whether anyone got infected, which would really be what you'd want to know. And much more importantly, this whole thing was set up to only measure what was going actually through the mask, not around the mask. And with an N95 mask, that's not as big a deal. But when you have a surgical mask, like this one, I'm going to put on this surgical mask right now, stuff's going to go right out the sides here and right up the top and right down the bottom. In fact, I can't even wear my radiation glasses with a surgical mask on because it goes right into the glasses. So that wasn't measured at all in this study. So interesting study. It did show that fleece actually, which is going to be used a lot in the winter, i.e. those fleece collars that you pull up, actually created more small droplets, so they were counterproductive. And again, the other conclusions were a bandana didn't work that great. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that. Cloth masks worked a little better, but again, they weren't measuring what was going out to the sides and up and down from the cloth mask. So the slums of Mumbai. Now, this is a really interesting picture. You see what looks like Central Park or maybe, a very nice part of New York City on the top. And then you see that demarcation for the other side of the tracks, and that's Mumbai, where the poor live. And that's basically shantytown. Now, this was a study done by the city of Mumbai. What's interesting here is they actually went into the slums and tested lots of people. They also did the same thing in that fancy looking New York City part. The most interesting part of this study is that 57% of the people in the slums of Mumbai were or had been infected with the novel coronavirus. And they also calculated the IFR. Remember, we've talked about the CFR versus the IFR. The CFR is the crude fatality rate. That's when someone shows up to the hospital. What's the likelihood that they're going to die? The IFR is the infection fatality rate. If I catch this thing at target, what's my likelihood of dying? And that was 0.05 to 0.1%. So 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 2,000 people who had caught this in the slums of Mumbai died. So very, very low. And that's consistent with the Stanford study that measured the infection fatality rate in and around California. So we now have these numbers coming out showing the infection fatality rate for the novel coronavirus is very low. That's great news. Again, you would think it would be all over the media. We'd be jumping up and down. We'd be seeing the planes fly over because we now know that this thing is not as deadly as they told us. But sadly, no, that ain't good for media eyeballs, so that's not the story you're hearing. Hydroxychloroquine. Now, we've heard so much about this drug. it's starting to get a little nutty. And it's probably the world's most controversial drug right now. Bottom line is, and I've reviewed this data a number of times on the website, the in-depth analysis shows that in some types of coronavirus disease, meaning usually less severe, this seems to be working. In the more severe patients on their deathbeds, it's not working. So this is an interesting analysis that came out this week, and I think it's food for thought because it's not a peer-reviewed study. It is quite a huge paper that was just kind of put up online. And what it kind of shows is in countries that went ahead and adopted the widespread use or allowed it of hydroxychloroquine, the death rate from COVID-19 was far lower, 78% lower in those countries versus those who did not. Now, lots of problems with that study, in quotes, but it's interesting stuff to take a look at, no doubt. The good is that we're talking about large numbers here. We're comparing one country to another country. But the bad news is there's lots of other differences between those countries that really weren't or really couldn't be controlled for in this analysis. And it claims that this is a randomized controlled trial, but it's not. A randomized controlled trial would only be if you decided to have these people use hydroxychloroquine and those people didn't, and then you measure them going forward. You can't do a randomized controlled trial going backwards. So that's probably why it wasn't really submitted for publication. College football. Man, I am a huge college football fan. You can see my Florida State helmets back here. I guess you can guess which team I like. But at the end of the day, this has been a crazy back and forth media football, trying to figure out, are we going to have a college football season? Is that season going to get canceled, et cetera, et cetera? So you've probably seen the news. The MAC conference came out and said they're not going to do it. The Big Ten came out and said they're probably not going to do it. The Pac-12 is probably not going to do it. ACC and SEC are probably going to do this. Now, what's been talked about is there's just too much risk for these football players. I think there's too much media risk, actually, for the conferences, not the football players. So the average age, obviously, of players is young, 18 to 22. And to date, an extremely small number of people in that age group have died of the coronavirus. In fact, 73 times more people in that age group have died of other causes. And again, that's a rare event for anyone in that age group to die than of coronavirus or COVID-19. And that means that the death rate approximately for this age group is 0.0075%. It is ridiculously low. And that means, given that there's 12,650 NCAA Division I football players, that there would only be a 1 in 10 chance, actually less than a 1 in 10 chance, that a single college football player would die of coronavirus during the season. So again, this is really not to protect the players. This is really to protect the media reputation of the conferences. Well, what about COVID myocarditis? There's this ESPN thing, and there's other folks that have come out and said that the Big Ten found 5 people with myocarditis, and those 5 people happen to have tested positive for COVID-19. So isn't that a huge concern? We're putting these kids at risk for heart damage. Not really. About 5% of all people who have any kind of respiratory virus, including the common cold, will have heart muscle involvement. And most of those don't generally know it. But when you actually look at things like EKGs and other tests, that's about what it is. So at the end of the day, there's lots of things that cause myocarditis. And let's just define this. Myocarditis means that there's inflammation of the heart muscle. That can cause nothing in the vast majority of people, all the way to death. But there's lots of other things that can cause it. Prescription drugs, cocaine, irritable bowel disease, lots of different bacteria and other organisms outside of COVID-19. And most people are really, or most experts, I should say, are really unsure that COVID-19 myocarditis is a thing. Why? Because in order to really diagnose this, you'd have to take a biopsy of the heart muscle to see if it contains a lot of COVID-19 virus, including inflammatory markers, etc. So most experts aren't even sure this exists yet. And if it exists, it's exceedingly rare. And of the 5 students who have this or were diagnosed with it, again, we don't know if A, myocarditis is related to B, COVID-19, but of those 5 people, again, the most common outcome is that everything's fine. So again, myocarditis is really not a reason not to let these kids play. So I always go over the good news. So there's definitely good news out there with the bad news. The bad news is usually media hype and hysteria. So let's look at some good news. Convalescent plasma. So what is this? Convalescent plasma is when someone gets sick with COVID-19 and recovers, which is the vast, vast, vast majority of people that get this disease. They've actually got antibodies in their serum or their plasma. So you collect their plasma and you give it to sick people who aren't recovering. Now, the good news is that this is now widespread. We now have a huge number of people a day, 1,500 a day, who are getting convalescent plasma. We've had tens of thousands treated, and the Mayo data, Mayo's really been leading this, shows that there's a 10% drop in the death rate, they believe related to the use of convalescent plasma. So that's all really good news. Another piece of good news this week was that children have less ACE2 receptors in their nasal passages. So what's an ACE2 receptor? ACE2 receptor is where the virus enters the cells. So if kids have less of these in their nasal passages, that would explain why they're not getting sick at anywhere near the rate that adults are getting sick. So that's it for my show today. Again, this is a weekly round robin. Please, please share this with people who are like-minded. It's so critical that we stop the media hype and the media hysteria and start to look at this with a critical eye. It's absolutely essential. So please share this with those you know, put it on Facebook, put it on wherever, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end of the day, stay safe and realize that you can come back here every week to get the real skinny medically on what's going on and to avoid the hype and hysteria. Thanks so much for watching and have a great day.